Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and I'd like to welcome you to the Practical Stoic Podcast, where I give you practical Stoic advice for modern times. If you'd like to learn more about Stoicism, or if you want some added inspiration in your day, just go to my website. It's risetothegoodlife.com. If you're interested in transforming your life with Stoic principles, then I also offer one-on-one coaching. To book your first free session, just head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching and follow the links. But for now, enjoy this episode. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. And today is a very special episode. As you guys know, I've been doing a few interviews lately, and this is one person who I've been very excited to interview, and I know that all of you will be very excited to listen to this. And today's guest is Donald Robertson. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'll give you a little bit of a spiel about who Donald is, and so here it is. Donald Robertson is a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, trainer, and author who specializes in the treatment of anxiety and the use of cognitive behavioral therapy and clinical hypnotherapy. He is the author of many articles on philosophy and psychotherapy in professional journals, and most of you will know him from his books, including The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy and Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. I'm so excited to have Donald on the show because I believe that few people have done more to further the work and influence of Stoicism in modern times. And so, without further ado, I give you my interview with Donald Robertson. So Donald, thank you so much for being on the show today. I know I'm really excited to be talking to you, and I know that our listeners will be equally excited to hear what you have to say. But for those in our audience who might not know so much about you, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here. So say hello to all of your listeners out there. I am a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, a trainer, and a writer. So I kind of do a bunch of different things, but most of my work revolves around cognitive behavioral therapy, personal development training, and Stoic philosophy, basically. And I do a lot of stuff with e-learning courses. And I am one of the members of a non-profit organization called Modern Stoicism, which is run by a multidisciplinary team of academics and psychologists. And so we do a lot of different things. I mean, if you don't mind me just kind of rattling off a list briefly,
Yeah,
I guess that'll double as a plug and a bit of context. So Modern Stoicism was founded about 5 years ago by Professor Chris Gill, emeritus professor of ancient thought at Exeter University in the UK. And there's like about 6 or 7 of us in the team. The makeup changes a bit over time, but I've been there since it was founded. Tim LeBon, Jules Evans, William Irving was on the team at one point, John Sellers. So a bunch of people that some of your listeners may have heard of that are involved in Stoicism. So we run the Stoicon conference every year. I organised it last year in Toronto. There was about 400 people. We run Stoicon X, kind of spin-off conferences in different cities all over the world every year. We run Stoic Week. Every year there were 7,000 people that participated online last year. So I'm the kind of person mainly responsible for the online aspects of Stoicism for Stoic Week, and some of the other members contribute to the content as well. Mm-hmm. We run a bigger course that we use to gather research data called Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training that runs once or twice a year. It should be running maybe in June if I have time. So I wrote that and I run that. And we also have the Modern Stoicism website and blog, and that blog takes guest articles from anybody that has something to state about Stoicism, ideally ordinary people that are applying it in daily lives. Greg Sadler, one of our team members, is editor of that, and it has over 500 articles in it from different people about Stoicism.
Wow.
So that's kind of something I'm involved in, and also I've written a bunch of books about Stoicism, and I deliver online courses about it, and I run a big Facebook group about Stoicism.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually one of my very first introductions to the Stoic community. When I first started learning about it, I joined that Facebook group, and it's just been amazing. Like the number of conversations that go on there every single day, it's really awesome.
There are 1,000 posts a month, I noticed recently, all of which I have to read. And it gets pretty hectic. It's interesting, actually. When I get time, I want to say a little bit more. I'll maybe say some more later in the interview. People often ask about applying Stoicism to daily life. And funnily enough, Facebook, social media is a really good example of that. And the Stoics have quite a lot of things that they would have to say about Facebook, for instance, and the way that we use these things. So it's kind of interesting to use that group and then also think about what Epictetus, for example, might have to say about the role that it plays in our lives and how we engage with other people online. So maybe we can discuss a little bit more about that later. But that group has nearly 39,000 people in it. When I wrote, I think it was Stoicism and the Art of Happiness you mentioned earlier, I think I said something in the beginning about one of the Yahoo groups that had I said, there's this community and it has 1,000 people in it, which at the time seemed pretty good. And now I look back at that and I think, well, we have communities that have nearly 40,000 people interested in Stoicism now. And someone wrote an article recently where they estimated that in all of these communities together, there must be roughly 100,000 people who are engaged in online discussions about Stoicism. So it's growing and growing and growing. But I still think there are many, many, many more people out there who are what I would describe as kind of quasi or semi-interested in Stoicism. There are many people who have read Marcus Aurelius and don't even really label him a Stoic. I haven't made the connection. But then when they find out about the communities, they're often very excited and get involved with that. Facebook reckon there are 1.5 million people who say that they like Marcus Aurelius in their Facebook profiles.
Yeah, that's
a lot of people.
Awesome. And yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think we've only just scratched the surface of how many people are interested in using philosophy and Stoicism to better their lives. And I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're involved in personal development and something that I honestly believe is that there's not a huge difference between personal development today and philosophy 2,000 years ago. It was all about bettering your life, becoming a better person, really, really using principles of philosophy to just improve your life. And that's what personal development's all about. And so I think as soon as we can bridge that gap between philosophy and personal development and bettering your life, I mean, more people will be open to the idea of studying it.
Well, it was more like that kind of from the outset, in a way, even the early natural philosophers kind of had a little bit more of a practical focus. And then Pythagoras had this thing that was kind of like a mystical cult or something that was very practically focused. But it really came to fruition with Socrates, who really introduced the concept of philosophy as a way of life. And then that split among his followers into a number of different traditions, including the Cynic Stoic tradition. And they sometimes an odd thing. I'd like today I'll talk a little bit about sort of controversies or thing, if you don't mind. I might as well, I will throw those in because I kind of fancy talking about some of them today. One of them is, sometimes people say, well, look, you guys that are into CBT and self-help, you're kind of reading that all into the Stoics. They weren't into that. All this stuff to do with psychotherapy. What's that got to do with Stoicism? And they're wrong. The Stoics used the medical model. It goes all the way back to Socrates, probably even further back to Pythagoras, but the Stoics are very interested in using the medical model, medical analogies to describe the philosophy that they're doing. It's full of therapeutic techniques. It was the inspiration for modern cognitive behavioral therapy in the first place, and they actually use the word therapy to describe aspects of Stoicism, the Stoic training that they were receiving. So Stoic psychotherapy was already there and very much a central part of it before people came along and made the connection with CBT. It's kind of the other way around. It's not that we developed psychotherapy and then project that onto Stoicism. It's that CBT was invented because the Stoics already had a psychotherapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see it all the way through their writings, even just in simple little techniques that they share that allow you to think more clearly or to act in a better way. And a lot of it is about opinions that we place on events in our lives. and the types of words that we use. And it's really amazing how modern and how applicable all of this philosophy is in today and in the future.
Well, I'm kind of biased in favor of Stoicism, so it sounds odd to people sometimes when I say this, but I really genuinely believe that the Stoics were surprisingly far ahead of their time in terms of some of the psychological observations that they make. And I sometimes I'll go into that in detail in my courses and so on, and substantiate it in length and detail. But there are things that they said that are concepts that psychotherapists in the early part of the 20th century were oblivious to. And it took us over half a century of psychotherapy to rediscover things that the Stoics were talking about 2,000 years ago, and we're discussing for a period spanning about 500 years. Stoicism from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius was around for nearly 5 centuries as a living tradition. And so for a long time, people were familiar with things that we then forgot about and had to only recently rediscover. And very important psychological observations, very subtle psychological observations that you make. You say that psychotherapy pervades their writings, and that's very true. And you just actually made me think as well of the fact that at the very beginning of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, in the first book, I said they use the word therapy. In book 1, he talks about his own personal Stoic mentor, Junius Rusticus, and he said that it was Rusticus that told him that he needed therapia, in the Stoic tradition. It's right there at the very opening chapter of the Meditations, and then the rest of the Meditations is an example, presumably, of what that therapy consisted in.
Yeah, wow. It really is incredible how modern everything that they were saying was. And that's really what drew me to Stoicism. It was a very practical philosophy, one that could just be used very simply. You just read the book, you find something that works with you, and then you just use it in your life, and bam. I don't think it's unreasonable to say to people that you can start seeing results today, this week, this month, just from starting to use these principles of Stoicism.
Well, it's funny because you'll get the odd stuffy character who gets into these. A lot of the classicists previously were quite snooty about it. And you'll see people making comments online saying, well, you can't really be into Stoicism unless you dedicate your whole life to studying it. Now, there's a kind of grain of truth in that. But if the purpose of making comments like that is to deter people from obtaining short-term benefits from it, then I think that's very misguided and harmful. It's not a good thing. So you'll see these attitudes being bounced around, and I think they're dying off now, though, because it becomes more and more apparent that people get genuine benefits both in the long term and in the short term from Stoicism. And I'll give you an interesting piece of substantiation for that. One of the things that the Stoics discovered, or that they talk about anyway, which is light years ahead of its time, is a technique that we'll talk about a bit more later called cognitive distancing. And there's a ton of research now that shows that cognitive distancing is a very powerful short-term therapeutic intervention, and long-term as well. In a very short space of time, people can begin to benefit from it. And it's absolutely central. It runs all the way through the Meditations. And so we have volumes of research evidence now that show that people who read Marcus Aurelius, if they understand that aspect of what he's talking about, they are likely to get short-term benefits from it, as well as then benefiting from the emotional resilience that the whole philosophy brings. Although I'd add to that for many people, what brings them to Stoicism is the therapeutic aspect of it, in the sense of dealing with unpleasant emotions. But as many people will point out, ultimately that's not what Stoicism is trying to make the goal of life. That would be a little bit more like the Epicurean goal in a way. I think the Stoics entice us in by offering us a way of coping with anxiety and depression and so on. But what they're ultimately selling us is something even more radical and fundamental than that. It's a whole worldview and set of values which they think are healthier for us at a much more radical, a much deeper level than simply getting rid of our anxiety and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to keep on talking about this. You mentioned we were going to talk about later these different principles that are that you teach from cognitive behavioral therapy. And I know you have a course on Stoicism that you teach. and it's called, for everybody who's interested, it's called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's right. It's a course about Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, absolutely. And so could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the course and what kind of principles people would be learning?
Well, I've been involved with e-learning for a long time, kind of like a lot of things that happened by accident. When I was doing CBT, I was invited to take part to help design a research project for the UK Department for the Environment, DEFRA. And it was on CBT, self-help for coping with stress, noise-related stress. It's called Coping with Noise. So we designed e-learning for that, and that was, it must have been like 15, 20 years ago now. And that kind of set me on this path of using e-learning for personal development and CBT. And then Stoic Week came along, and so we designed an online course. We wanted to reach out to people around the world doing that. We got large numbers of people involved in that. But I wanted to develop another course of my own that had to do with Stoicism, and I wanted to make it very different. I felt, there are a bunch of books coming out now, as you mentioned earlier, actually, my bookshelf is kind of piling up with things as well. There's more and more self-help books coming out about Stoicism, but the majority of them are kind of general introductions to Stoic self-help. And so I wanted to write more about Stoicism and CBT and self-help, but I wanted to make it somehow quite different from all that stuff. I didn't want to just do the same thing again. And, I thought, well, look, it seems to me that one of the best ways to teach Stoicism is by looking at a person, a role model, at an example. And I find that when we approach it in that way, it seems like a whole different ball game. And there are a couple of typical misconceptions that people have about Stoicism that you can get really into the weeds kind of trying to address. I'll talk about them in a minute. But they are simply swept aside very easily when we actually look at real Stoics. Suddenly these kind of misunderstandings that people have from trying to understand the Greek texts become obviously absurd when we look at Marcus Aurelius as a living human being. And the Stoics themselves did this. They thought that it was the best way to teach was through living examples. And they, again, at the beginning of the Meditations, that's what Marcus Aurelius is doing. In Book 1, which is different from all of the other books, he, at great length, contemplates the virtues of his friends and family members, 16 different people he goes through, and examines in detail what he can learn from their example before he then begins to practice his aphorisms and philosophical arguments and so on in the rest of the book. So he starts off by role modeling in the first chapter. And I thought, well, if that's good enough for Marcus Aurelius, maybe that's how we should be approaching Stoicism a little bit more, by looking at examples or role models. Epictetus tells his students repeatedly, look at Socrates, look at Diogenes the Cynic, become emulators of these guys. The philosophy is like a commentary in a way on what they were doing right. And so I thought, well, who are we going to take as our role model? Because we don't really know much about Zeno anymore. We've got a few anecdotes and stuff. And then I realized, funnily enough, although he would never have held himself up as a teacher in this way, Marcus Aurelius is our best example because we know far more about him than any of these other philosophers, for the simple reason that he was a celebrity in a sense. He was an emperor, so there are histories written about him, and there are other historical sources of evidence, archaeological evidence from coinage and so on. So we know quite a lot more about Marcus as a person than we do about any of the other Stoics. And that makes him a perfect example. And also the Meditations has these biographical aspects to it that have interested people over the years as well. Little hints throughout the text, but also Book 1 tells us a lot about his education, his family and friends and so on. So we can paint a rounded picture. And the way I like to describe it is we're kind of putting a human face on Stoicism by approaching it, starting with this example of a living Stoic and what he did, his attitudes, what he said, and then comparing that to the exercises and the sayings and so on that we actually find in the Meditations.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for sharing all that. I completely agree with the whole practice of finding a great example or a mentor and really trying to follow them. It's something that's so incredibly important. Even Seneca talks about this all the time. He says, we should have somebody constantly in our mind who and act as if they're watching us, somebody who we want to emulate. I think people generally do this in life anyway, but what we're saying here is if you want to live a Stoic life, let's find a really great Stoic mentor for you, somebody who's going to really teach you about how to apply this philosophy to your life. And
I think that's very much what the Stoics themselves did. It was understood to a large extent as a tradition that was passed on from teacher to student or mentor. Really, the relationship was much closer than a professor or a lecturer to a student. Many famous Romans had Stoic teachers that lived in their house, were friends with them, that were part of their household. And we have, interestingly, you won't find this properly described in many books on Stoicism, but we actually have a book surviving today that describes this Stoic therapeutic relationship. And it was written not by a Stoic, but by Galen, Marcus Aurelius' court physician.
Wow.
And Galen was a doctor, but he was a kind of polymath. He'd studied Stoicism and he'd studied other philosophies. He was quite eclectic in his thinking, but we have a book by him called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Mind's Passions. Is that right? And it stands in a tradition of books, most of which are lost to us, on psychotherapy. And the main one is a book by Chrysippus, the second head of the Stoa, called The Therapeutics. And so Galen has read this, seemingly, and a bunch of other books, and this is his own version of it that's a little bit more eclectic, but he quotes the Stoics in it, so he's clearly drawing on Stoicism to a large extent. And so in that book we have an interesting description of what it would have been like to be a Stoic student, and there's a lot of emphasis, which he links to Zeno and Chrysippus, on the idea of finding someone who you're confident has wisdom and virtue. And then Galen says it's probably going to be an older person, because you need to see evidence in their life that they've actually exhibited these qualities. And then you should ask them to basically become your mentor by critiquing your character. And this requires a relationship of complete honesty and frankness and trust, he says. And in Marcus, we can see that role was probably filled by Junius Rusticus, who's his main Stoic tutor. So we get a really interesting description there of how central this kind of relationship possibly was to Stoicism. And once we understand that, I think it makes a lot of sense out of a lot of the things that Marcus then goes on to say. There are many passages in the Meditations where he talks, for example, about never doing anything that would require curtains or walls, and that every thought that you should be willing to speak out loud. And all of these sort of things can be seen as in the light of this idea of having a frank relationship with a mentor that you kind of confess everything to.
Yeah, wow, oh my gosh, you just shared so many insights there. And that book sounds so interesting. I'm going to definitely put a link there to all of the books that you've written, and also that one, because I'm sure so many people in the community would just be stoked to hear about that. And
there are lots of little things like that aren't very well known that I think are kind of keys to understanding Stoicism that allow us to suddenly make more sense out of better known texts like Marcus Aurelius.
Absolutely. And I wanted to maybe move on to giving our audience some practical tips for how they can apply Stoicism, but I wanted to start with this question, which is more about the larger community of humanity. And I wanted to know, what do you think are one or two problems that we face in modern society that can be solved using Stoicism?
Well, if you don't mind me perhaps focusing one particular example, I'm going to go back to Facebook, which we mentioned earlier, because because I run groups on Facebook, so it's part of my business, it's part of my job to deal with it. So I kind of have to deal with it to some extent, but I can see how much other people use social media now. It's become almost, like as big as religion, does it? It's taken over, many aspects of people's lives. And in terms of the sheer amount of time, look at the impact that it's had on politics.
Yeah.
And the way that people digest news has been completely transformed by the algorithms in the social media, like showing them in their feed, the sort of views that they engage with and react to, biasing everything and so on. But the power of it, has become a hot topic. And I think it's an interesting challenge it presents. It's probably been underestimated in some ways. It really deserves to be discussed more by philosophers. And it's not such a, strange as it might seem, it's not such an alien concept to Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. In the ancient world, they have gossip. And Epictetus talks a lot about, he tells his students to be careful who they engage in conversations with. In fact, that's one of the recurring themes in the discourses of Epictetus. Be careful about the company that you keep. Be careful about the sort of conversations that you get into. And, be careful about the amount of time that you're spending on frivolous pursuits and conversations. And the emphasis that the Stoics put on not allowing ourselves to be swept away by rhetoric and learning to view things as objectively as possible. I think these are important things that Stoicism has to tell us about the way that we consume information today. We're flooded with it. The Stoics would think this is very dangerous in their mind. But it also has the potential to do good as well. It allows us to get in touch with people that we might be able to benefit from talking to. Like, it allows it. We wouldn't have these Stoic communities. And there's a kind of diaspora of Stoic. They're spread all over the world, and we wouldn't have connected them if it wasn't for social media. So that can potentially be a very powerful aspect of it. But people often get into arguments.
Very often.
And there's trolling, and like the way that people use it is often very kind of flippant and stuff. It sort of encourages that. It's hard to have a serious philosophical debate on Facebook. You're more likely just to get lots of people kind of making glib comments in response to quotes and so on. And again, the Stoics would warn us to be very wary of that. It's a kind of a waste of our time, they think, and it's easy to be consumed by it. Again, also in book one of the Meditations, Marcus talks about how he's glad that he didn't become absorbed in certain pursuits that would be he talks about quail fighting, which seems pretty anachronistic. But I think of that as a little bit like video games today. It's a form of gambling, I think, or a trivial sport that he thinks it was important. His tutors told him to, not waste too much time on. With Marcus, he had his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, also studied under some of the same Stoic tutors, but he went down the opposite path in life, and I think was possibly an alcoholic. But certainly he drank a lot, and he got in a lot of fights, allegedly. He went around a lot of brothels. He was always on holiday and partying. He loved gladiatorial games and drinking parties. He loved the chariot racing. He spent all of his time in these kind of things and hardly any time actually doing his job. He was supposed to be in charge of the Parthian War, but the stories are that he hardly did anything. He went to the east and spent most of his time drinking and like partying and so on. And so Marcus is almost this opposite of his adoptive brother, even though they both went to the same philosophical lectures. And, Lucius, a recurring theme in the ancient literature is this idea that often people kind of falling in with the wrong company and keeping company with people that are kind of tempting or dragging them away from the real goal of life. And that's kind of what social media potentially does for us as well. But it's hard sometimes not to get into arguments with people on social media, because some people say very offensive, insulting things, and there are trolls and so on. And the Stoics probably have quite a lot to tell us about how to avoid reacting to these provocations as well.
Yeah, Yeah, well, Facebook is it's such a weird one, isn't it? Like, even myself, I've really tried to not get involved in any sort of disagreements on Facebook because I know what happens. What happens is you go to websites that are going to prove your point, you bring facts back and you share them, and then they go to websites that are going to prove their point. Nobody gets anywhere. And it's very difficult to have a meaningful, genuine conversation between two people when it's having an argument over Facebook. But there are so many great things that you can get out of it.
Yeah, very seldom have I seen anyone change their opinion.
Exactly.
In any of these debates, it just doesn't really seem to happen much. And yeah, like you say, people will just kind of look for what information supports them and ignore anything that contradicts them. It's, you can see these very unhealthy sort of discussions evolving. Yeah. But the Stoics give us a lot of advice. There's a section. There are many things that they say. And some of their fundamental doctrines are useful here as well. So Epictetus tells his students to say, when anyone insults them or offends them, simply to say, that's how it seemed to him. He says, it seems so to him. Like, literally, that's what you should say to yourself, and then move on. Yeah. By not waste too much time by getting triggered by, as it were, provoked by other people's insults and so on. The Stoics were very laconic. Like, they emulated the Spartans in many ways. Cicero, we know in one of his speeches, says this outright about Cato. He says, you guys, you talk like Spartans. And we say laconic now after the name of the region in which Sparta was located. So this kind of very pithy way of speaking, the Stoics cherished being concise. And so, they think this is important because it helps us to avoid kind of getting swept away by our thoughts and going off at a tangent and so on. So they often give advice about just responding in very concise, brief ways. It seemed so to him, or it seemed right to him, depending on how you want to translate it. And Marcus has, when people read the Meditations, when I first started researching Stoicism, I remember people saying to me, look, the Stoics don't kind of have a system, which is crazy. Like, they've totally got a big system. Everything's systematic about it. But people say Marcus's Meditations is just a bunch of notes, like a diary or a journal or something like that. There's no structure to it. It's very formulaic. There's a little structure to it. And when he's talking about different problems, he frequently lists a range of techniques. The best example is anger. He, in book 11, I think it is, of the Meditations, he goes through a list of 10 separate strategies that he uses to cope with anger, and they're all recognizable. Some of them are clearly just variations of very generic Stoic therapeutic practices, but it's nice that he gives us kind of shopping list and he says, here's the full range of techniques that I'm familiar with. And probably in other Stoic texts that are lost to us now, these things were laid out much more systematically. We can kind of see that Marcus is taking this for granted in his aphorisms and so on. So he has a whole bunch of techniques there that would be useful to people dealing with provocations, trolls, flaming, and so on, and online communities. And one of them is, just to say, for instance, I think you mentioned earlier this idea, it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. And, Marcus says, well, in relation to other people insulting you, it's not their actions, it's not their words that upset us, but it's our judgments, our opinions about it. That's what upsets us. Yeah. That's where the distress comes from. That is cognitive distancing. That that technique in itself, realizing he returns to that so many times throughout the Meditations as a way of coping with different situations. But there it is, particularly as a way of coping with anger. And the other thing he mentions, his favorite technique for coping with anger is perhaps the one that seems strangest to people today. He simply tells himself that human beings are designed by nature to be social creatures, and that we there have an obligation to ourselves to fulfill that potential by interacting with other people well. And so he keeps reminding himself of this fact as his first go-to strategy when he's having problems dealing with another person.
Yeah. That's all really, really helpful information for anyone dealing with trolls on Facebook or arguments. And I mean, personally, for me, something that always helps for me to think about it is how the Stoics often teach us that we should be in the crowd but not of the crowd. And so, when you're on Facebook, do like Marcus Aurelius said just there, be sociable, be kind to everybody, get involved in the community. That's what's so wonderful about Facebook is it really does bring home this whole idea of Stoicism, which is we're all part of one community globally. But at the same time, don't be of that crowd. Don't be the person who is... because everybody's getting angry. Everybody is shouting at each other. Everybody is getting involved in arguments. Don't be in that crowd. Be in the crowd, but not of the crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you've reminded me as well, there's another theme in Stoicism, which is that Marcus spells out very well. He says that those are 10 techniques from Apollo and his muses. Apollo is the god of healing. And one of his children, one of his sons, was Asclepius, another god of healing, god of medicine and the healing arts, to whom Socrates said that he owed a cock in sacrifice during his execution. And Marcus elsewhere says, well, imagine that when people say offensive things to you or bad things happen, that it's kind of a prescription from the god Asclepius, and this is kind of being prescribed for you by nature as an opportunity for you to develop virtue. And the other metaphor he likes using is that imagine these events are kind of like a sparring partner in the gymnasium, like you're wrestling with them. You don't kind of resent it if they grab you around the neck or something like that, or dash you against the ground, he said. There's no bitterness about it, but you ready yourself to deal with it, and you accept it, you even welcome it because it's an opportunity for you to develop strength of character. And so seeing Facebook as this kind of training ground for Stoicism almost is, maybe one way of looking at it, or like a prescription. We're being prescribed all this stuff so that we have an opportunity to inoculate ourselves against it, developing antibodies by exposing ourselves to it. As long as we use it in the right way, Marcus would say it becomes actually therapeutic for us. It becomes an opportunity to strengthen ourselves.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that whole idea of looking at life as if it's happening for you. And, I really think that is one of the main principles of Stoicism, which I usually tie to modern personal development, and it gives me a boost in confidence that my opinion is right when I say that philosophy back then was just personal development today. That's what it was. Even people like Tony Robbins, for example, one of his main teachings is that we should act as if life is happening for us, not to us. So when crap things happen to us in life, act as if that was meant to happen and you're supposed to get something out of this. And that's what's so beautiful about this philosophy that you're talking about.
Well, one of the favourite sayings that goes at least maybe back to Zeno, certainly back to Chrysippus of the Stoics, is that the wise man uses everything well. Like everything that befalls him, he makes good use of.
Yep.
It's all kind of grist for the mill. Pierre Hadot said something strange. One of the modern scholars of Stoicism, he said that to him it seemed as if that the Stoics conceived the whole universe as a machine for manufacturing sages.
Yeah.
So it's constantly kind of feeding stuff, which if we use it properly can potentially lead us towards wisdom and virtue. It can strengthen us. And the characteristic of the sage is that he processes all of this in the right way, whatever it is. He makes good use of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that idea of making use of every part of life, no matter what happens. And I know we're slowly running out of time, but I was wondering, could I ask a couple more questions and then I'll get you? Yeah, cool. So as you know, this podcast is all about practicality and making sure that we can use Stoicism in our life. So I was wondering, could you share maybe one or two principles, unless you've already shared them so far, one or two principles that you've really found useful in your own life?
Well, we've talked about some things, but like I said, there are a lot of Stoic techniques, and sometimes people aren't familiar with them all. Some of them are easier to explain, some of them are harder to explain. I looked at one of my books recently because someone asked me about how many there were. I think I counted that in my first book in Stoicism, I made a list of about 18, 16, 18, something like that. There's probably round about, there's probably a few more that I missed, that I've thought about since. But I would say there's maybe about 20 distinct psychological techniques that we can identify in the Stoic literature. So I'm going to. Which one will I pick? The one that I'd pick is one that we don't find discussed much in modern therapy. So my first book was an overview of all the similarities between Stoicism and modern CBT. And, there are similarities that we can find. Some of them are obvious, some of them are a little bit more subtle. But there's a very striking Stoic technique that doesn't really correspond to much in modern therapy. There's little hints of things, but no obvious parallel technique. And I started experimenting with it about 20 years ago when I first kind of got into Stoicism. With workshops, I ran courses. I was a trainer, and in my own life as well. Pierre Hadot calls it the view from above. Now, over the years, I've kind of developed names I ended up giving these techniques, but the Stoics themselves often don't tell us what these techniques are actually called, funnily enough, with one or two exceptions. They just kind of take them for granted. They don't really use the names that presumably they have for them. So we tend to call this the view from above, which is a modern name. And I did it with groups of people. I remember the first time I wasn't sure how they would respond. And so I was surprised that they all went, yeah, this makes perfect sense. And this is awesome. I'm going to practice doing this at home. Can you make us a recording of it? And I thought, I was almost a little bit surprised. They responded in the same way that they do to modern therapy techniques. And I thought, but this technique doesn't really occur in modern self-help books. It's surprising because it seems almost like an archetypal, a kind of perennial technique. It should be obvious. It consists of imagining. Now, you can find that in some places, but it's not a common modern self-help technique. And it surprises me that it isn't, because it occurs not only in the Stoic tradition, but as Hadot points out, in other Epicurean, the Platonic or academic tradition as well, and the poets. It was well known in the ancient world. Marcus talks a lot about it. He gives us some beautiful examples of it. But we don't really do that in CBT. It's a very powerful technique, and it's something I've found very useful over the years. And as Hadot also says, in some ways it seems to bring together many Stoic themes, because it forces us, if we practice it a lot, not only to gain cognitive distance from things, so to be able to kind of dilute our emotional responses to things that are upsetting us in the here and now by looking down on the world as if we're looking at a map. As if we're looking at it from space, from a hot air balloon, from high above. Or you could say like the Olympian gods, the gods looking down from Mount Olympus and seeing humans like ants below them. So if we imagine things from this elevated perspective, we tend to be less upset about them. We see them as more transient, because we're kind of picturing their context more. We depersonalize things a bit because we imagine all the other people in the world going about their business. And potentially it makes us think more about our own mortality as well, because we're thinking about the whole of space and time. So it really starts to bring many different threads of Stoicism together into a single cosmological vision, in a sense. So there's two versions of it. One I call the sort of Olympian perspective, where as if we're looking down from the top of a mountain or high above. And then the other one I call the cosmological perspective, where we're really trying to picture something more metaphysical or cosmological. We're thinking of the totality of space and time, and how small the present moment is in the vast river of time, and how small our body is and the planet Earth, like a speck of dust in the whole universe. So these things kind of seem more insignificant to us, that are troubling us at the time. And then all that's left that matters external seem trivial. What matters now is how we respond to them, whether we respond well or whether we respond badly. So taking more responsibility for what we then do next, what we then do in response to the world. The Stoics, I think, believed that this whole perspective was more closer to the truth, and that when we look at things narrowly, we're in a sense committing a lie of omission, because the truth about the universe would be the whole big picture. But as humans, we're very limited through our senses to only looking at one small aspect of it at a time. And so the Stoics ask themselves, well, how does it change the way we feel when we look at the truth comprehensively? Sometimes they use the phrase a comprehensive view of things. Now, we know in modern therapy that when you do that, it will tend to dilute emotional responses. So it contributes to Stoic indifference inevitably. The more we broaden our perspective, we take in a wider range of cues or triggers, and those all have a kind of diluting effect on the way we react emotionally. We know one of the most robust findings in modern psychotherapy is that when people become emotionally distressed, particularly when they're anxious, the scope of their attention becomes significantly narrowed, like a laser beam. So they focus on the things that are distressing them more. And when they're more relaxed, their attention broadens. They can take in more cues, more things simultaneously. So the Stoics are, this idea of expanding the scope of our attention is very consistent with modern research in psychotherapy.
Yeah, I love that principle. And yeah, I agree. It's not talked about often enough. And it really is so helpful. If I could share a very quick example, I mean, my wife and I were sitting on top of a mountain here on the Sunshine Coast just a few days ago, and I looked down and I said to Jen, I said, those trees down at the bottom of this mountain look like what grass looks like to us when we're standing up on the ground. But to us, when we're amongst those trees, they're just massive. And every single person that's driving on that road or at that beach that we can see, that every single person thinks that their life is the most important thing right now, and that what they've got going on right now is the most important thing. And so do we, but when you look at it from above, it seems so insignificant. So I just wanted to share that. But this last question that I wanted to ask you, for anyone who is new to Stoicism or just getting introduced to it, what are one or two resources that you would recommend that they go straight to right now?
Well, that's easy. And everyone should give the same answer to this question, actually, because everyone should be supporting the Modern Stoicism non-profit organization. Because its job is to promote Stoicism and to foster knowledge about it. And it's completely open, philanthropic. It's about public engagement. Anybody can be involved with Modern Stoicism. And so it's a hub for communities, for information to be dispersed. So the website of it is modernstoicism.com. And if you go there, you'll see all the articles, but you can also follow it on Twitter, and you'll learn about the events that are organized, the other activities. And like I say, anybody can volunteer to help with Modern Stoicism. So that's a really good place to start, and it's a good launching pad, because if you read the articles on that website, you'll learn a lot about the various books that are popular, and you'll get a kind of broad perspective on the subject as well, because there are like hundreds of different people that have contributed articles there from all walks of life. Academics, but also ordinary people that have used Stoicism to cope with illness, that use Stoicism to deal with the challenges of parenting, that are using Stoicism in their jobs, policemen, firemen, and school teachers. So you'll get a very down to earth and very broad introduction to Stoicism that way.
Yeah, awesome. And so I'll include links to all of that you've just mentioned there in the show notes, and I'll also include links to your books where people can get them, and your other websites. Is there anywhere else that you want people to go that can allow them to follow you and get involved in what you're doing?
Well, if you want to have a look at my website, and then that'll probably give you links to my e-learning courses and all that kind of stuff. My website is just donaldrobertson.name, NAME, and if you go there's an e-learning site connected to it, and there's a whole bunch of online courses. Most of them are actually free courses that act as introductions to Stoicism, and there are free ebooks that people can download about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. So yeah, everything kind of comes back to that web address.
Great. Well, Donald, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that you've shared so much value here. I know that my audience is just going to love this. And, everybody reached out to me and said, we really want to have Donald Robertson on the show. So it's been awesome to have you here. And I know that next time we could talk for another 50 minutes, I'd love to have you back. But until then, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to do it, and I just appreciate being given the opportunity to talk about my favourite subject. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Thank you so
goodbye
much.
to everybody.
Ciao.
Cheers.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this interview. I had such a good time talking with Donald, and I know that you guys will have taken so much out of that interview. He just shared so much value there. And before I sign off, I wanted to encourage you guys to get in contact with me if there is anyone who you'd like to hear on the podcast. You can do that via the Facebook page or the Facebook group, which is the Practical Stoic Mastermind, or just send me an email on my website, risetothegoodlife.com. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode once again, and I'll talk to you next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. I hope that you've gotten a lot of value out of it, and I hope that it helps you to live a better life. If you have enjoyed the podcast, then don't forget to subscribe so that you'll be the first to know when there are new episodes. If you really love the podcast, then I would appreciate a positive review, whether that's on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever else you listen. Don't forget that if you're interested in one-on-one Stoic coaching, then you can head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching to book your first free session today.